Good morning, afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on cash and voucher assistance and risk, perception versus reality. My name is Anna Kondakchan. I'm the Global Programs Coordinator with CaLP, a network of over 90 organizations active in cash and voucher assistance space. Let me start with a few housekeeping points first. So this is a 60-minute conversation. We encourage you to use the Q&A box to submit questions for panelists and to upvote questions that you like to be answered. Please use the chat function for general comments and peer-to-peer exchange. We will be recording the conversation and make it available as soon as we can. I should also say that today's discussion is organized under the umbrella of the Grand Bargain Cash Workstream annual virtual meeting series. And the organizers, CaLP and WFP, co-lead the risk sub-workstream, which aims to promote learning, knowledge exchange, and convene conversations such as the one we'll be having today. So over the past 12 months, closed and open door conversations were organized in MENA, West Africa, and at CaLP's Cash Week in London. We've released podcasts that dive into political economy of risk in cash and voucher assistance and issues around data management. CaLP also released a scoping study on risk in financial management and compliance. We'll be sharing a full list of resources available for you at the end of the webinar. Today, we hope to take a closer look at the real and perceived risks of CVA versus other modalities of aid. And we have an amazing panel lined up. So we have with us today Ms. Nana Amoa, who is a development economist and program management specialist with 12 years of experience in regional and country portfolio management in Africa. Nana served as a head of field office with WFP Cameroon from May 2018 until December 2019, where she was responsible for managing field operations in the east of Cameroon. Nana will talk about the risks that CVA field practitioners have to manage based on her experiences from the region and reflect on what needs to happen next to help address the challenges faced. Then we will hear from Dr. Nisar Majid, who manages the Somalia country portfolio of the Conflict Research Program at London School of Economics and Political Science. He has worked in and on Somalia and the Somali territories for over 20 years and co-authored the book Famine in Somalia 2011-12, Competing Imperatives, Collective Failure, which came out in 2016. He has been involved in documenting the evolution of cash programming in Somalia over the last 15 years. Dr. Nisar will talk about the positioning of CVA as a modality within the broader political economy of aid and the implications that this has for policymakers, donors, implementers, especially in the context of COVID-19. And last but not least, we'll hear from Oliver May, an author and independent consultant specializing in risk management of fraud, bribery, corruption, conflicts of interest, nepotism, theft, sanction breaches. The list is long. Oli will reflect on the lessons that can be drawn from a recent large-scale misappropriation in Democratic Republic of Congo involving multiple modalities of aid, and also what actions CVA implementers, donors, and regulators can take to avoid a repeat. Also to flag that we are co-moderating the conversation. So Susan van Balekom from WFP, who co-leads the risk sub-workstream, will be moderating the Q&A. But before I hand over to Nana, a couple of relevant facts to share with you from the just launched State of the World's Cash 2020 report. that could, I hope, help frame the conversation. So how has CVA changed since 2018? I mean, the scale of humanitarian CVA has doubled, reaching approximately $5.6 billion US dollars at the end of 2019. And we see consistent perceptions of improvements in the quality of CVA programming, especially among subnational actors. But despite this, more than half of practitioners are concerned that there's a risk that quality may suffer as CVA continues to increase in scale and other barriers to its use remain. So management of risks associated with CVA, as you can see from the graph on your screens now, is among top 3 challenges to scale up for that practitioners have reported. And if we dive deeper into the data, we can see that fraud, corruption, aid diversion were selected by practitioners as being one of the biggest perceived risks of scaling up CVA. Key informants that we interviewed for this publication commented on the disproportionate focus on fraud and auditing for CVA compared to in-kind assistance. That makes cash appear more resource and time intensive, although overall it could actually be less. Report also finds that insecurity, perceived and real, has changed how CVA is implemented in contexts where counterterrorism measures are in effect. And in the context of de-risking, there's a tension between counterterrorism measures and humanitarian principles, particularly the principle of neutrality and impartiality. We also find that electronic cash has helped to reduce the risk of leakage and fraud, although this is still perceived as a significant concern in countries in conflict. And we hear of cases where donors and governments have requested recipients are screened against counterterrorism legislation, which of course increases data protection and security risk for staff and recipients and impacts on operational independence. So some key informants that we spoke with suggested that funders were more concerned with the risks than the needs of people, and that the fact that this applies for cash but not in-kind assistance goes against humanitarian principles. While others indicated that perceived risks are not playing out in practice and that they can be mitigated. So I will stop here and on this note, hand over to Nana to get us going. Thank you. Over to you, Nana.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, for that introduction. I think you covered most of the aspects I was going to talk about with regards to the difference between the perceived and the actual risks that humanitarian actors face on the ground when it comes to cash and voucher assistance programs. So my presentation today will draw from my experiences, like you mentioned, in Cameroon, while managing cash and voucher assistance programs for Central African refugees, but also draw on the experiences from colleagues who've worked across Mali, Nigeria, CAR itself, Niger, and the DRC. Next slide, please. So there definitely are a large number of risks that we faced in the field, and some of them that I believe are worth mentioning. Definitely on the top of the list is abuse of power. So with the increasing reliance on cash as a transfer modality, we've seen that lots of stakeholders involved in the process, field agents, financial service providers, and even other private sector stakeholders are taking advantage of this process and abusing the power that they have. So some of the risks that we face in the field, as well as our beneficiaries, have to do with extortion, bribery, manipulation of exchange rates, and even sometimes people going as far as faking voucher papers and voucher documents. Another risk that we face in the field is particularly in terms of targeting and identifying beneficiaries. So with the process of ensuring that our food assistance programs are targeting the right beneficiaries who have high levels of vulnerability, one of the things we face in the field is even partner agencies and financial service providers taking money from beneficiaries in order to have them on the list of food assistance. So this was definitely one of the major risks we faced. And it's one of the risks that lots of humanitarian actors are dealing with across the various humanitarian assistance programs. So not just cash and voucher assistance, but also in kind. There's also the risk of the monopoly of financial service providers. I think one of the aspects of cash and voucher assistance that we need to be clear on is the aspect of the technicality involved. So it's not as simple as moving food from one place to another. There's specific, let's say we take e-voucher or mobile money cash transfers. There are specific financial service providers that are able to do this. And half of the time, you may just have one partner in the field that's working with the various agencies and hence has a monopoly over the cash and voucher assistance programs. And in that monopoly, they take advantage of beneficiary rights, which are the basic human rights, and sometimes also go back to extorting money from them. One other risk I will probably highlight today is also collusion between field agency staff and beneficiaries. And again, I think this even cuts across sexual exploitation and asking for certain things from beneficiaries that aren't humanitarian. They are against human rights and also are just adding more risks to cash and voucher assistance programs. Another point another risk which I would highlight today is the risk of data and misuse of personal data of beneficiaries. I think the point isn't showing on the presentation, but this is one new or more recent risk that we're seeing because of the increased use of online transfer systems. So there needs to be a framework within agencies and within organizations where there's accountability for the staff that have to handle beneficiary personal data, and also reducing the risk of discrimination with the data that's available on beneficiaries. Of course, the risk of gender issues and protection of women has been highlighted in cash and voucher assistance. It is important, I think, for me to highlight here that this is a risk that cuts across various modalities in humanitarian assistance. So there's more of a highlight on this with cash and voucher assistance, but actually the analysis that we've seen in the field hasn't shown, a higher correlation with cash and voucher assistance as well as with other assistance programs. And then lastly, there's also the element of insecurity and access to area of intervention, especially in the context of places like Mali, where there's a lot of insecurity, and even in other areas, even in Cameroon, as well as in Niger. So for field experiences and the actuality on the ground, I would say some of the perceived risks are actual risks that we face, but it's very important that we're able to identify, what is actually happening on the ground and take stock. And I think this brings me to my next slide, which talks about recommendations and things we can do in order to address some of the risks that we're facing on the ground. So one of the main recommendations that I would say in this case is ensuring that we have, with all agencies involved in humanitarian actions, but ensuring that we have risk assessment protocol for each modality delivery mechanism. The reason why this is important is because half of the time we're all using various ways to address the challenges on the ground, the challenges in the field, whether it's improving food security or improving protection of our beneficiaries. It's important that our risk assessment protocols are aligned with each other. So across all the different UN agencies and the different NGOs and partners on the ground, it helps us to reevaluate the context as well, and also document the evolving risks that being faced day to day by the field agents. The next recommendation I'll make is ensuring that we can diversify financial service providers and also diversify the complaints mechanisms that are available. So we want to make sure, that the complaint mechanisms that are available to beneficiaries are actually adapted to their needs, and they're able to use them in a timely fashion and timely manner, and give feedback to the field agents so that we're able to adapt our cash and voucher programs. And of course, diversifying the financial service providers will evidently reduce the risk of monopoly in the field. The other recommendation that I would make to address some of the challenges we face in the field is building the capacity of beneficiaries of cash and voucher assistance in digital literacy. So most often than not, our beneficiaries are, struggling to get by. And it's important that before we implement any kind of cash and voucher assistance program, that we take the time to sensitize them and ensure that they understand the modalities of the program. That way, I think it minimizes the risks of abuse of power by the financial service providers, and as well as the field agents. Another recommendation I would make, which might sound contradictory, because again, some of the risks and mitigation measures in cash and voucher assistance seem contradictory, and hence the ability to generate good practices, it becomes challenging. So for instance, we would want to encourage more transparency and information around the program itself. So cash and voucher assistance programs, whatever delivery mechanism that's specific to it. However, in giving too much information sometimes, particularly to different stakeholder groups. So in this case, having open dialogue with governments, with the financial service providers, with different partners in the field, we're also opening ourselves up to them being able to use that information for various actions, and sometimes we can't control. But at the same time, we want to be able to give them information so there's buy-in and so that there's some accountability on their part. So it's sort of a pull-push recommendation. It's a recommendation that I would give lightly, because there should be a framework around ensuring that the people who have this information keep it confidential, and also use it mainly within the humanitarian community. And of course, one of the main points that I would strongly recommend is having coordination bodies that can focus and that are responsible for documenting the risks that are faced in the field, and also coming up with mitigation measures that are adaptable to the various contexts. I think I can speak on the experiences of the cash working group in Cameroon. It's very helpful to have a group that's coordinating across various stakeholders and also across various humanitarian actor groups, just so that we're able to highlight the challenges that are faced and the risks that are encountered in the field by these different agents, and then come up with a holistic framework that covers and addresses and puts together mitigation measures for the different stakeholders involved. And lastly, improving project communication and sensitization with beneficiaries and partners. This is a recommendation that cuts across, the various humanitarian modality delivery mechanisms. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that beneficiaries are informed of what their rights are and what they are entitled to, and at the same time, field agents and financial service providers are also aware of beneficiary rights, because sometimes you realize in the field that people have different perspectives of what's expected, and also what their roles and responsibilities are. And so there is a last point. Clarifying roles and responsibilities within the implementing agencies and developing an accountability matrix. I think this is more of a recommendation for within the agencies and within the partner organizations. There's a need to have accountability across the board. So the various departments, so not just program departments that handle the food assistance programs on the ground, or whichever humanitarian action programs on the ground, but also ensure that from finance to the procurement units, there are specific people that are highlighted and that are identified to provide the assistance to beneficiaries. So at the end of the day, we know who we can go back to for accountability. So these are just examples of recommendations that can address some of the risks that we faced in the field. I know there are more recommendations, but again, I think I will strongly highlight having cash working groups across various contexts that will help to draw from lessons learned from different partners, and also have the responsibility of putting together mitigation measures that are adaptable and that evolve with the context. So my next slide, I believe, has recommendations for resources. But
if that's okay, Nana, maybe we can cover the resources towards the end, but thank you ever so much. And
thank you, Anna.
Thanks. I mean, some really important points there on your sort of first reflection on risks, that not all the risks that we think of as perceived, actually some of them are real, faced in the field, but at the same time not all the risks apply to CVA alone, but across multiple modalities, which may be yeah, some food for thought there. My other reflection based on your recommendations, I think it feels like as we are introducing some mitigation measures, we are at the same time opening another set of risks. So it's always a sort of a balancing act, a careful one. Thank you, Nana. We would like to zoom out now from sort of the operational perspective into the broad political economy of aid and CVA positioning as a modality within it. So it would be great to hear from you, Nisar, now on your reflections based on your research and Somalia experience. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Samoa. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the positioning of cash and voucher programming as a modality within the broader political economy of aid, and also consider some of the issues around this in relation to the COVID-19 response at the moment. I'm just going to talk rather than use a presentation. So Somalia is a really interesting context, actually, for the development of cash and voucher-based programming, and it's played an important role in terms of our understanding of the evolution of these modalities over the last 15 years in a very complex and violent context, including in times of famine, and I'll refer to some of that history in a minute. First of all, a political economy perspective, what does this mean? It essentially means, in a nutshell, considering how the economy or economic factors interplay with a political system. So that's our basic starting point. In Somalia, international aid has long been a significant part of both national and local political economies. And aid, international aid, trade and remittances are frequently referred to as the main sectors of the economy, and all are part of complex power dynamics and contestation. And this interaction in the case of aid has been the case since the late 70s during the Ethiopia-Somalia war, and has been the subject of academic and policy-related research ever since. So we've got a deeply embedded political economy of aid in somewhere like Somalia, but I'm sure to differing extents, it's the case in many other contexts. So when we talk about aid and aid resources, what do we actually mean? And I think here we're not just talking about cash or vouchers. We can include contracts for accommodation and car hire in field offices, contracts between organizations, international, local, UN, NGOs, national NGOs, private consulting companies, third-party monitoring companies, and also vendors selected where vouchers can be cashed. We're also talking about contracts for security, jobs, and finally the material transfers themselves. So food or cash or vouchers are only part of a whole assemblage of possibilities for gaining access to resources. And all of these forms of resources are part of the political economy of Somalia. And to a significant extent, the control of these resources reflects local power dynamics and can be instrumental in determining who has power over who and who gets resources disproportionately where others don't. And you can describe this political economy or this competition for control of resources in different ways: corruption, diversion, manipulation, part of patronage networks. They're essentially different framings and lenses for the same types of processes. And I think it's also important to emphasize that manipulation of aid is often blamed on so-called local actors, government and local NGOs in particular. And this is definitely not the case in my experience. I think the DRC case that is going to be spoken about it's also not the case there. International agencies are as much part of the local political economy in themselves through their own direct programs and actions, as well as part of the relationships with their partners. And this came out in two large multi-country studies I was involved in several years ago, one funded by DFID and one funded by ECHO. So in those studies, we found that good practice, as well as abuses of power, were not specific to a particular type of agency, international or national, nor do they necessarily represent an agency as a whole. Agencies can act with integrity in one area while being enmeshed in local power dynamics in another. So to come back to the first question of where we see the positioning of cash and voucher-based programming, it's interesting to reflect on this history in Somalia. In 2005 to 2010, cash in Somalia was small scale and a welcome alternative to food aid, where food aid had been subject to manipulation for many years, for the past 10 to 15 years, or the previous 10 to 15 years. And one could argue and demonstrate that cash was different for a while. It was much less subject to manipulation. However, there were particular reasons for that, which have not been fully explored, but it was, you could say that it was small scale. There was a huge incentive and investment to making it work because it was being piloted in a fragile context, in an insecure environment. But I would say that that's an argument that you could make, and contrast cash therefore with food, ended in 2011 as cash was scaled up during the famine response in 2011 in Somalia, and as the context changed. So we at the Conflicts Research Programme recently completed a study entitled Food and Power in Somalia, Business as Usual, ? Which examined the shift from food aid to cash over the last 20 years from a political economy perspective. And it's a long report, it's available on our website, but in a nutshell, what we found is a dispersal of power, where a cartel of business people with strong influence in politics had monopolized the largest aid contracts in the country for many years, with a big scandal in 2010 around WFP and around that relationship. Then there was a withdrawal of big food aid agencies, a famine took place in 2011, and cash was scaled up because of the absence of food aid organizations. And cash and voucher programming has remained the dominant modality ever since, so since 2011. And now this modality has moved and changed further in Somalia, and mobile money and electronic vouchers through WFP are the dominant forms of transfers. So the effect of this shift from food to cash and vouchers has been to disperse power, with large food aid contractors now absent, and many UN agencies and NGOs involved in distributing cash and vouchers. And there is there's a new concentration of power associated with cash and vouchers taking place through the big telecommunications provider that most organizations work with, and more recently through WFP that's developed a big electronic voucher program. And so power has shifted basically as a result of over time in Somalia. And I think what's also important to remember is that, or to note that in 2015, 16, 17, in some of the studies that I referred to earlier, we were able to talk frankly to some of the biggest international aid actors on this subject of the political economy of aid and their own incorporation into local power dynamics. And some admitted, they'd finally kind of acknowledged after many years how deeply enmeshed they were in the political economy in local areas, and actually that they were undergoing deep processes of organizational transformation. And they recognized that the creation of improved monitoring systems was not enough. Actually, this was about long established practices, and you needed to really think about your organizational culture and not assume that third-party monitoring and improvement in your monitoring systems was going to solve some of the problems. And that's a kind of point of which at which I'll come on to the second point that I was supposed to speak to, which was looking forward in COVID-19 times. And clearly cash will remain a part of the COVID response, as it should, and it has some advantages, particularly in terms of mobile money and in terms of electronic vouchers. And Suzanne Jaspers, who led the study for us on food and power in Somalia, also wrote a very interesting blog post discussing remote forms of monitoring now as we are forced to work more remotely. And she referred to both Sudan and Somalia, raising a number of issues around increased remote programming. So that she raised 3 points. That one still has to consider the power effects of the infrastructure and logistics associated with mobile forms of aid transfer. And one has to maintain and improve context-specific analysis using independent and qualitative methods to prevent what she said was creating alternative realities, and that power relations and inequality do not disappear if you do not see them. So just to expand on one of those points, I think, again, the point of monitoring techniques and analyses, we use this framing of the front stage and the backstage in the humanitarian theatre as an analogy proposed by Deportes. And if we think about monitoring systems, the front stage is dominated by quantitative indicators and assessments, and these methods have their value and there's a lot put into them. And they're driven by donors, and they've dominated our understanding, our analysis of success. But monitoring and evaluation processes, quantitative based, don't have the time, the capacity, or ask the right questions to delve deeply into political economy and power dynamics, which is the backstage. So at the front stage, you've got the kind of way that we talk about aid in more technical terms, and the backstage is talking about what we also know in terms of the reality of local politics or national politics and power dynamics. And obviously there are very good examples of, I'm not making a complete distinction between the two, but there's a need to bring the two together, the technical with the political. We live in these environments are intensely political, and we're part of the context. We're not external to the context. And that means relying more on qualitative forms of information gathering. It means really talking to people actually in detail and in depth. And this can be done remotely. It can certainly be done remotely in countries like Somalia. So in summary, for me, an over-focus on cash and voucher-based programming is missing the point. The aid sector is weak at exploring its entire positionality, and rather prefers to assess its success in more technical forms, in technical methods and technical language, focused on the material transfer at the bottom of the chain. Cash may be differently incorporated into the political economy than other modalities, but it is part of the same assemblage of actors and networks, and so it needs to be considered more fully in its entirety. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nisar. I can see the engagement in the Q&A box picked up significantly. So we're just going to move straight to Oli now to dive into the recent experience in DRC and what lessons can be drawn. Not to eat into the Q&A time later. Thank you. And Dr. Nisar, if you wouldn't mind sharing a link to the research that you were referencing in the chat box, that would be amazing. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening from Australia. So yes, I've been invited to share some reflections on that recent case in DRC, but I'll actually share some reflections as well from the various cases of fraud, corruption, counterterrorism, and other issues that I've dealt with in CVA operations over the last decade in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So I'll only really gently touch on the DRC matter. What I want to do is make 5 or 6 key points here, but they're ones that I think are relevant to the management of risk beyond the fraud and corruption and counterterrorism risk domains as well. And I would emphasize as well that they're personal reflections. And I'd actually say that I think in that case in DRC, from what's been reported, there's not a lot there that we haven't actually seen before. One thing that is interesting though, and my first takeaway, is the learning-oriented and collegiate response that was role modeled by the agency concerned. According to Philip Kleinfeld's report in the New Humanitarian, the investigation was exhaustive, involving more than 200 interviewees. As the article suggested, other potentially affected agencies may have conducted much more cursory or shorter reviews, and that really resonates with me. It's that latter approach that I regret is probably more common in our sector. And this is something that we need to address because we need to see investigations as business improvement tools. These are important learning experiences, and factually orientated appraisals of what happened is important for the design of future controls and procedures. Regrettably, I think we still generally see investigation as a cost and a distraction rather than something which benefits our work. That said, we still need to be sensitive in how we go about doing it. I'm in Australia and we have a relatively high degree of confidence in our police and our courts. So a word like investigation carries very positive connotations. It feels like taking action or getting to the truth. But we have to understand, of course, that we're working in contexts where Transparency International's Global Corruptions Barometer might suggest that the police and the courts are the least trusted and most corrupt institutions of all. So in those places, a word like investigation might carry very different connotations. It might feel like fear and harassment, and we need to be alive to that. Similarly, the agency alerted other organizations that were potentially victims. And again, and this is to a point that Nana made, this is something as a sector that we don't make the most of, even now in 2020. Entering into MOUs and sharing information with our agencies on fraud and corruption risk is absolutely vital. Fraud and corruption love silence. They can't handle it when we start sharing data and sharing information. My second takeaway was the role of insiders, so corruption. In this matter, staff allegedly took bribes to manipulate the beneficiary lists, and that's certainly a form of corruption that I've seen plenty of times. I dealt with a matter in another African country, for example, where staff not only colluded with each other, but with an implementing partner and with the third-party monitor. Now, while we might be quite fraud aware in CVA, we still tend to focus on third-party risk. We focus on partners, on contractors, on financial service providers, on beneficiaries and the public. Often agencies don't adequately invest in managing the risks of corruption in their own staff. And again, to Nana's point, there's a lot of crossover with the PSEA risk domain here. The enablers of corruption are often around transparency and accountability and internal culture. And that's exactly what we saw, of course, in the 2018 safeguarding crisis. So until agencies see managing integrity risks like these as less of a cost or an add-on and more a fundamental part of protecting donor, supporter and beneficiary trust, i.e. a core part of programming, we won't see the investment that we need to lower those risks. If a CVA program is vulnerable to corruption, then the CVA program itself can be less at fault than the organization's wider approach to managing integrity. My third reflection builds on my opening remarks that there was nothing in DRC that we haven't seen before. And to keep improving the resilience of CVA as we learn more about these risks means having more nuanced conversations about those risks. And having more nuanced conversations about those risks with donors, with regulators and the public is dependent on our sector changing our language about risk. And in particular, talking less about zero tolerance and more about managed residual risk. I found myself diving into the history of that term zero tolerance for my new book on terrorist diversion in aid. And I was curious to find it's actually a phrase that only really gained traction as recently as the 1970s, emerging from the world of law enforcement and politics. And it does not transpose well into the world of risk management, where it can mislead expectations and generate confusion. It's not a particularly helpful phrase in respect of any risk domain relevant to CVA. Take fraud, for example. All organizations in the aid value chain need to recognize that the inherent risk of fraud and corruption will never be eliminated. If we had zero tolerance for fraud, we wouldn't work in DRC or Syria or frankly Sydney city centre. The most secure shop in the whole world is one that has no windows, no products and no displays. It also has no customers. The phrase, I think, is part of a quest for certainty, assurance that there will be no loss, and certainly not to a prescribed or sanctioned entity. We sometimes see this expressed, of course, in the language of donor contracts. But I've been fighting serious organised crime for more than 15 years, and there isn't a circumstance on earth where you could be assured that you would be at no risk at all. You can take reasonable steps to manage those risks, but every opportunity comes with risk attached. But that prevalence of the phrase zero tolerance and the quest for certainty, I think, is a symptom of the same issue that leads some to think of CVA as automatically riskier than in-kind aid. And that is a lower general level of risk maturity throughout our sector, donors included, than I think we need. When I think about in-kind aid, the fraud matters that I've dealt with around NFIs and food distributions, I note that each operation had a different risk profile. And there were no doubt examples of in-kind operations that were actually higher risk than CVA operations. In-kind aid, for example, has to be purchased from providers, it has to be stored, it has to be transported, it has to be distributed and accounted for, and all of those points in the chain create fraud and corruption risk. Meanwhile, it also shares many risk points with CVA, program design, beneficiary selection, program monitoring, MEL, staff to run the program, local authorities to engage with. In the end, the risk of any one aid operation is a nuanced deduction. Risk maturity is not the same thing as having mountains of procedures, audits, and checklists. In fact, it's often the opposite. So if we had a good level of risk maturity in our sector, our answer to the question, is cash at a higher risk than in-kind aid, would be, it depends, tell me more about the program. Finally, and returning to the DRC matter, I don't know how many people caught this in the news coverage, but the New Humanitarian reported that allegedly complicit shopkeepers told them that they borrowed money from local loan sharks to afford the bribes necessary to participate in the scheme. This is a really important point from a do no harm perspective. There is a wider corrosive effect of fraud and corruption in aid, and one which is ill at ease with a world-weary, old-school humanitarian attitude of acceptance that I have sometimes encountered. Accepting that there will be residual risk does not mean letting fraud or other risks materialize. It means doing everything reasonable to minimize those risks and commit to a virtuous cycle of improvement, seeing materialized incidents as opportunities to strengthen our approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Ole. Wow. You can see in the chat, you know, there's your words of no such thing as zero tolerance, zero risk. You have to accept some, otherwise don't get out the door. Resonating with the group today. Okay, we've had quite an active Q&A. Quite a number of questions already raised. So I'm just going to hand over to Suzanne to move into that section. Thank you, Suzanne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. Thank you very much, panelists, for your interventions. We have a couple of questions, and I'm going to read them out of the question and answer chat. I'm not going to give the microphone to the people who ask the questions, just because it's easier to manage this way. The first question is for you, Nana, and it's Kristen who asks it. The question goes, the risk recommendations are strong and respond clearly to the risks identified. How do you see cash at scale being able to include these risk mitigation measures? For example, the push for diversity of FSPs, financial service providers, is difficult to justify against the push for common delivery mechanisms to save costs. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Kristen, for the question. It's very true, and I think there are challenges that we're facing for implementing cash at scale. I would definitely say that the diversification of FSPs is just one example, but I would also highly recommend that there has to be analyses that are conducted in a context-specific zone. There definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all, and I think if diversifying financial service providers isn't the solution, there'll definitely be other options and other alternatives to consider. So it's an ongoing discussion, I believe, and I think some of the recommendations can be applied, and in their application, hopefully address some of the risks. So yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. If any other panelists want to jump in, otherwise I'll move to the next question that is highest rated. Over. You can shake your head. Okay. Then Nana, sorry, the next one's for you as well. I don't think we could have avoided this one, but can you speak to risk mitigation measures taken in Cameroon in the context of COVID-19? So from your personal experience, is there anything specific that you've done programming-wise? Over.
Okay, maybe I should clarify, I'm not in Cameroon anymore. So I might not be the best person to speak to that, because I actually do not know what risk mitigation measures are being taken now. I would rather refer to WFP colleagues who are currently in Cameroon.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's solve it that way. I'm gonna respond after the webinar with some materials in terms of what WFP has done in response to COVID-19, some particular measures. I know that there's a lot of resources as well that speak to this on the CaLP website that are not just WFP related. It's just that Anna used to work for WFP, so we can send some materials over in that regard. Moving on to the next question, and I'm gonna send it to Dr. Nizar. This comes from Catherine Touch. I'm just going to read it out. You might have read it yourself as well. It's basically pointing to if you have any comments on how humanitarian and development actors should rather focus on strengthening community voices with diverse options of expressing concerns, abandoning action and consequences, if not a real shift and a more equitable distribution of power. Because you've spoken to the shift of political economic power focus from a group of influential bigger actors to another group, but what does it say about the more local voices and actors?
No, I think that, that's a really crucial issue, is what's the relationship these days in some of our contexts between aid actors and local populations? And I think it's fair to say that in general, I mean, there are always exceptions, is that there's a breakdown actually of a relationship. The NGOs and aid actors claim to represent local populations and local voices, but I think too much of the time they don't really, because they're wrapped up in their own worlds and their own bubbles, and in insecure environments in particular, like in Somalia, it is actually quite difficult to have some of those conversations, because field staff are not out with communities as much as they could be because of security-driven programming. So I think it's a big problem across the sector. I think it's widely understood that it's not easy, but also the raison d'etre of a lot of NGOs in being a representative voice of local populations is gone. And actually, in many cases, they're part of power dynamics on the ground. They represent one group and not another, or at the expense of another. So it does demand, it's a big, profound question, actually.
Opening the floor to other panelists if they would like to comment. No. Okay, then the next question is, I think, for all of the panelists. It relates to Nana's intervention. So Nana raised an interesting and very valid point about the risks of monopolies of financial service providers. I would contend that there are also risks of having monopolies of humanitarian agencies. How do the panelists see the risks of monopolies within our own system, what kind of risks do you see, abuse of power, disempowering local actors, and how to mitigate those when there is such a strong push to centralize CVA in the hands of the few humanitarian actors? Please put your hand up if you feel comfortable enough to respond to this question, panelists. Oh, thank you, Nana. Thank you, Nana, for taking the one for the team there. Oh,
I felt like I didn't have a choice. It's a touchy subject, to be honest. And again, I think I will raise the point about the elements of abuse of power, of corruption and fraud are not limited to CVA. I think across the board, there's a weakness that the humanitarian, playing field needs to address, and that's putting in place stronger controls and stronger risk mitigation measures to address some of these challenges. So I can't speak on the monopoly of the humanitarian agencies, but I think the risks that are faced across the board definitely need to be addressed as a whole. And perhaps I would have actually said sometimes in the field you have more competition across the various agencies, competition in the sense that, when it comes to performance and results. So there's that eagerness to do your best in the field. And so then there's sometimes not as much as, there's not so much, I guess, communication within. But I would say a lot of the challenges that are faced can be addressed if, first of all, we are open to talk about them and also put together those mitigation measures, which again brings me back to the recommendation for coordinating bodies like cash working groups and humanitarian country teams that can address such issues at a high level. So I don't know if my other panelist colleagues want to add anything.
I mean, I think if I just might come in, I think certainly again in the Somalia case, there's definitely a real feeling that when risks are high or when there's been a kind of scandal, this occurred in 2011, the international agencies are the beneficiaries. They're the ones that donors can turn to with claiming that they can manage the risks. And I think certainly for local or national NGOs, they feel that that's unfair and that excludes them. And it works in competitive terms for international organizations. So I think it is a problem, a structural problem within the system. And if we talk about capacity building, what does that say about our ability over time to ensure that national actors are able to manage some of these dynamics, or supported to manage some of these dynamics? And rather, what does happen is that they become even weaker subcontractors of international organizations, getting very little additional support in order to improve their systems.
thank you. Oliver, the last one is for you. I think there's one more, we can slip in one more. There's one specific question. If you can elaborate a little bit more about who is talking about zero tolerance regarding CVA risks. Is that the language of a specific donor or a specific government?
Yes, it is. I continue to see this in specific policies for specific organizations, including international NGOs, and sometimes bizarrely in risk appetite statements as well. Now, it's not necessarily talking specifically about CVA, it's talking about all operations in respect of individual agencies. And that clearly affects the environment in which CVA operations are happening and the way in which the risks for CVA are perceived.
Thank you, very clear. Okay, I think in interest of time, this concludes the question and answer session. There's a couple of action points that we need to follow up on our behalf. Some resources we have promised to send to you, either, as I said, live on the COVID-19 response and in the chat as well, and some extra resources behind some of the risks that Nana mentioned in her presentation. So we will do that. Over to Anna for the wrap up.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all the panelists. As we were going through the Q&A, I was frantically trying to summarize what would be the key messages. So allow me to scroll through, and apologies if it's making you dizzy. But I think what we heard from Nana, it's a caution that in mitigating one set of risk, we will probably be creating a set of new ones. And that for safe programming, it is paramount to have clear accountability matrices in place, and a conversation about expectations from all the actors in the delivery chain. Then from Dr. Nisar, an important takeaway that manipulation of aid is often blamed on local actors, but it's actually very much not the case based on the research and evidence, as well as the kind of increased focus on technical aspects and monitoring and evaluation is also not enough. Culture needs to change. And when we move into the COVID-19 context, remote monitoring actually requires more effort, not less. What stuck with me is that otherwise there will be in a we risk creating a parallel reality. And from Oli, we have increasingly actors, CVA actors, fraud aware, but the focus perhaps needs to shift from third-party risk to sort of accepting that same risk exists among own staff. And that the language needs to change from zero tolerance to residual risk management. Also an acceptance that each operation, whether CVA or in kind, will have a risk profile that needs to be managed. That gives us risk maturity, but it sounded like we have a long way to go to get there. Thank you again. I cannot, okay, with 1 minute to spare, let's do a quick lightning round. So Nana, then Dr. Nisar, then Oli. What is the one action that you would recommend humanitarian CVA actors need to take to get better at risk management? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. One point I will highlight is that there needs to be an improved structure and framework for CVA coordinating groups. So whether they are cash working groups, whether they are, very specific working groups in country, but there have to be an improved framework around which they're able to, the role is expanded for these groups to document, the risks on the ground. And also they are responsible for coming up with mitigation measures that evolve with the time. Because again, I think COVID-19 gives us more of a reason to ensure that our models and our programming are adaptable to changing times. So yeah, I'll definitely say structuring and improving cash working group, cash coordinating bodies in, in country. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. And Dr. Nisar.
Yeah, well, you've summarized very well, actually, Anna. Well done. I think safe spaces to have honest discussions within and between agencies on these kind of social and political dynamics. I think that, for me, that is crucial, that we talk about how we engage in many different ways. We need to have the confidence and the safety to discuss in real honest language. So and it's difficult to do that. So you've got to create safe spaces for more discussion, and that it has to be drawn also from qualitative research, not just from quantitative research. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Oli.
Risk assessment is collaborative. So when we're doing it, we need to access the right skills, the right knowledge, the right experience. We need to create the right space and time for it. We need to keep it simple, and we need to keep it practical.
Wow. Lots to take on. Thank you ever so much, all the panelists, my co-moderator, and lovely Pauline Perez, who was keeping us trouble-free through all this webinar. And finally, to all the participants. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you are. We are disconnecting now. Thank you.